Let's be honest, using 3D can be one of the most powerful tools in a concept artist's toolkit. However, there is a catch. It can quietly kill your artistic voice or your design intuition if utilized the wrong way. And so as a 2D artist, what can start as a perspective aid or a lighting reference or an iteration multiplier can easily start to turn your work into something that's more stiff, something overworked, and quite lifeless. And as an instructor, I see this all the time among student work. The artists, they trace their block-ins quite too literally. They let the default lighting make all the decisions for them. And of course, they're gonna get buried under all these incidental, very perfect looking details. And the result is always very predictable. You get something that's very technically accurate, maybe in regards to like a painting or something structurally, but it definitely feels more like a render than a fleshed out design. There's no gesture, no rhythm, and no story. The artistic merit completely evaporates in the process. So in today's video, I will be breaking down the most common traps I see a lot of students fall into when using 3D as a base. This is going to range from losing that gesture and shape control, to that passive lighting and value design, to detail overload, and that struggle to reintegrate that more painterly and artistic qualities back into the 3D. More importantly, today's examples will be from my own students, whether they're part of my course or members of my Patreon, with their permission, of course. We're gonna learn how we can reassert control over our 3D block-ins so that our art looks like we made it and not the software. This is the Brush Sauce Theater. Your creative edge starts here. So the first problem I want to address today is that over-reliance on the 3D as a base. And this is quite a big problem because the 3D tends to become more of a crutch. And when this happens, it's going to lead the artist simply to trace or paint over it perhaps too literally. And in some of these instances, if the artist is a little bit more of an inexperienced painter, they're going to overwork everything as well. And a lot of my students that typically want to approach using 3D at this stage, they're going to lean into 3D for accuracy because it can approximate such vast and complex scenes very accurately, especially in architecture and vehicle design. And the struggle happens is basically when the student wants to bring it all together for like a nice sort of level of finish that doesn't look too heavily reliant on the 3D. And the big thing here is that it's easy to forget that the 3D is supposed to support the idea, not necessarily dictate it. So with Ali's first example here, this is an example of when basically 3D can get quite overworked. Everything is kind of blown out. Everything is a bit of a mess. Now, if you actually take a look at the base 3D, it has the opposite effect, right? Like the base 3D here looks way too stiff, way too generic, way too mid-2000s sort of rendery, right? It lacks a lot of like the polish that you would want to get out of a scene like this. And he kept working at this because we kept talking about it, and his later attempts, I feel, balanced this out a lot more successfully. Sure, it's not absolutely perfect, but it's certainly a step up, and it's balancing more the artistic qualities with the lighting and the depth than looking either overworked or too underworked in a way, right? It's about finding this balance. For my next example on this, my former student Josh Ash, who's been doing some Fundamental Fridays over here, really leaned into using 3D in a great way, simply as a support structure and not the actual design. And this is where I would actually encourage a lot of design students to actually use 3D, right? Because your job as an artist, think of it as to like interpret the 3D, not necessarily obey it, right? So if I put on the 3D over his literal sort of drawing here, you can see it's quite simple, it's quite blocky, and it lacks any sort of like artistic sort of merit. So in a typical sort of fashion, Josh simply just drew over it, not taking anything here quite too literally. So the actionable thing that you could do is to draw through the model and start every paint over, in a sense, by doing a 2 to 3 minute loose sort of gesture sketch over it. No rendering yet, just gesture, exaggeration, and rhythm. Make the forms yours before you detail and before you actually get in there and start painting. And the next major issue that I want to talk about is that loss of gesture and shape appeal, right? The problem is that the 3D geometry is inherently correct, but it can often flatten that expressive shape language that is crucial in good design. So Richard's got a really cool idea here. He's tweaked it to the point now where it's got some, movement and some strategic use of overlapping, but the lighting and volume, the value blocking isn't present in the 3D, and it often isn't, honestly. And at this stage, the issue is the modeling tools are really emphasizing precision over that gesture, over that readability even. So even if you're not tackling it by adding a 3D volume into your scene to help add that depth, your mind internally, you still want to be planning for those future steps, like we can kind of see here in this really rough paint over. So even though we're getting a lot of 3D and accurate detail, we still need to group, and we still want to probably simplify a lot of those moving forward. And that's exactly what he started to do as he then pushed the 3D render a little bit further, and then eventually, of course, prepared that for his actual paint over. So in these sort of scenarios, what you're going to actually want to do is to pick, 2 or 3 anchor lines or shapes. And as you can see, with the right amount of planning and foresight, the 3D in this scenario didn't necessarily hold him back too much, and basically helped him push a rather complex and intricate sort of idea. I think he handled this rather successfully. Right? If I continue to push this as is, that would generally be fine. Like we could ultimately try to make that work. But honestly, what I like to do is pick 2 to 3 anchor lines or shapes and push or pull those to help that 3D model that is very blocky and that is very stiff. So basically, when you see the 3D version of this, everything is a little bit more exaggerated and less perfect. You can either simply do this with like a skew or the warp tool, or take the tip from part 1 and literally draw through the square shapes that are very perfectly calculated. Alright guys, and before we move on to the next one, I just wanted to give a quick reminder that we do have a mailing list over at brushsauceacademy.com. It's where I do drop all the free resources, the behind the scenes update, and early access to anything big that we're working on. And currently our one-on-one mentorships are currently booked solid into 2026. So if you do like personalized learning with custom curriculums and access to our network, definitely check the links below. All the info I have is in the description of this video. Alright, let's get on to number 3 here. Alright, so for the third big issue I want to go over today, that's when the lighting and the value control becomes way too passive. The problem is the artists often accept the default lighting from the renders instead of designing that light with intentionality. And this is so common because a great 3D render like my patrons use here gives us so much information, right? It's very fast, it's very instant in a way once you set up all your light sources and hit the render button in something like Blender. However, in these scenarios, it lacks that dramatic narrative sort of lighting and feeling, right? That feeling that a painting or a cinematic still can often give us that the 3D just fails short on delivering. And as you can see, how she transformed this one is just a fantastic example of how to approach this. Everything is a lot more subtle, and almost in a way you can see she delicately approached painting a lot of the surface textures manually on our own. You can start to see the brush strokes and the streaks within areas of the wood. You can see that approach to surfaces like the rocks, and definitely elements like the roofing, and then the trees in the backgrounds entirely painted from scratch, right? Straight up replaced. And that's all those are. Those trees in the background, if it's not already obvious, they're just placeholders. But one of my bigger tips for artists that like this more hand-done sort of approach to the 3D is to not actually push their 3D textures any further than these sort of flat color ones, right, that we see here, right? There's no PBR textures, there's no bumping and normal maps. None of that on this. They're just flat. And then that makes it actually much easier to get in there and say like, okay, if we do have like a timber sort of beam like this and we want to start modifying how that looks and how that texture feels, we could certainly do that by just zooming into our designated areas with our favorite brushes, right? And manually addressing and definitely kind of painting in our texture in a much more fluid and natural sort of way. The other important thing to remember is when doing something like this is to break up, right, these very perfect looking edges. See, like everything here with the 3D is very perfect. So it, in my experience, it's a lot better to help start to break these edges and these forms up. You could either do that like I'm doing here, literally going over it with a harder brush, or you could either, and then of course you could add a bit of a mid-tone in there as well. So that's like that subtle little transition, right, that's going to happen in between that light side and that shadow side. It tends to be a little more saturated too than either like the shadow or the light side. It's representative of the object's local color much more. See, then you can just blend and mix that edge. So you just do this over a little while. That's going to help your 3D exponentially in this process that you'll be overpainting. So you look at that edge compared to the 3D edge, right? Vastly improved. The other thing that you could actually do is kind of turn off your lights in 3D, right? You could just basically paint the light or the shadow or even use gradients on top as if there were like no render at all. So you just want to make sure you decide your key light, your bounce light, and any other light sources very deliberately. And that's exactly, right, like what Elijah did here. He treated the render very simply, and that it's essentially not the king. Like you can absolutely get in there, modify it, and boss it around. I think that the best way to approach this is often enough just to get like certain sort of masks, and like I mentioned just a moment ago, just drop in bold design decisions in regards to like what you want the light. So do you want it on light on dark? Do you want to pull in, you know, like a little bit of atmosphere from like the left or the right? And basically it can work as to start to frame, right, your core sort of subject matters. So often enough you can do this with very big sort of shapes. Essentially we're solving a lot of very big problems, right, with very simple tools. So see, in this case, like I simply just took out all the lighting, and then of course, like let's say if I do want some of that light to kind of hit in certain areas, right, like I can actually get in there and erase that. Now I'm doing this a little more rough and quick here, but it just shows that like you don't need to let the 3D essentially solve, right, all of your problems. Erasing like that. Or another way I like to do this too, it's like I try to, you know, guesstimate that like there's a cast shadow over here, and literally just select bigger sort of areas, even like this. And instead of using like a hard sort of chiseled brush, you could do this a little more softly with an actual airbrush. The selection tool here is absolutely important when it comes to a step like this, because it allows you to quickly keep things clean and at least a little sharp and accurate. So for example, see, I just selected that little spot. I'm hiding that selection, and then gently using the eraser to get in there and spot treat, see some of that light just like that. So see, we don't need to rely on the 3D for the lighting, and we can make these decisions very manually. That'll also help us grow faster as an artist too, if the 3D isn't attempting to solve all of our problems for us. Now the fourth biggest issue that I see is detail overload or misplaced detail. Right, the problem is that these 3D renders, they can contain tons of incidental details and information that doesn't necessarily support the composition or the design. This is most common if artists are using pre-made kit bash kits or assets, you know, from a various sort of store that are already very high detail, very high fidelity, right? So there's a lot of realism there, but then the issue becomes when you don't simplify enough to control over the bigger shapes and those decisions that go with them. And so in these cases, from these guns that we designed, you know, several years ago at this point, they're very detailed. right? There's lots of little details because parts of these were made, again, with pre-made machined hard surface pieces. So it was very easy to get treads and other gears and springs and pistons. And it felt, accurate for the time. But our direction would have it on this sort of project that we need to basically simplify quite a lot of those details even more. So part of the other problem is because we can see it in 3D very fast and we could see it in concept, very fast as well, it makes us want to be attached to those and keep them. But in reality, it may not serve the project in an ideal sort of way. So all of these designs basically went through a separate, more simplified sort of pass, and they're bolder, they're sharper, they speak the design language of their intended use and purpose. Everything is bulkier, it's sturdier, it's more utilitarian, right, as a result, and therefore the designs are a lot more successful. So it's often about like, okay, the 3D provided us with a lot of information. Now I have to artistically decide what to pull out, what to remove, and what to edit. My student Cesar did that really, really well in this scene that he put together. And because it's, again, a very complex sort of scene, a lot of the artistry on his side became, what do I keep? What do I remove? And then how do I flourish that? And so my general tip for artists like Cesar and anyone else in a similar predicament where you do have a very detailed 3D render, pick a sort of hero zone. So in his case, it was right here. Then pick a secondary reed, which is the top of this head. Everything else gets simplified, right? Use big brushes to mass out shadows, to use atmosphere. See, lots of atmosphere happening in this to just simplify a lot of that information. So this is about establishing a sense of visual hierarchy that the 3D cannot make that decision for you, right? You have to be the pilot in control when it comes to designing a scene, just like this. And for that last big sort of pitfall that I wanted to talk about today was reintegrating those painter qualities. So again, I think you had a very good example of using a 3D base, right? That's structurally sound, that is accurate in regards to its light and shadow, but then really artistically got in there and made a lot of those intentful sort of decisions to push it, to transcend it, right, well beyond there. So as you can see, this just comes to making really good decisions for the piece itself. See, lots of the shapes and the shadows were further pushed and organized, right? Just keeping, for example, like a sliver of light on this roof and then putting like that against this shape of shadow right here, or literally taking this side of the roof and actually putting it in shadow, right, just to kind of group it, because before it's just kind of getting all lost and we have weird sort of shadowing, that artifacting in a way that happens, right, as a result from the 3D. She also took very good care to really approach adding some painterly and textural qualities to the ground, right, which you can kind of see there, right? It's a little bit more natural. It's got a little bit more of that nice visual sort of noise that just wasn't there or would never be there unless you model it in to begin with. And you can see that she really kind of pushed a lot of that feeling of bounce light underneath this sort of like gazebo-like structure. Sorry, I don't know the technical term for that off the top of my head. And if we were to look to improve this a little bit further, see, this is too blue still. And if I were to push this even further, that's what I would start to suggest, is to balance this lighting with this a little bit more naturally, and then maybe lighten some of these shapes while still keeping it firmly grouped in the shadows. That would certainly help as well. Because see, look at that, it's mostly kind of untouched in that regard. But I mean, overall, she did a very good job really just approaching painting. And as you can see with foliage, most of the time 3D foliage looks very 3D-ish. It's probably better just to use that as a reference point and straight out paint those in with your own sort of brushes. Now, I, as one of my best design students in the group mentorship, and she took many, many steps to get the 3D block out to this level, right? There's a lot going on here. And depending on your own individual expertise and goals with 3D, maybe it is better to set up environments and skies and water simulators within Blender. But she's still learning a lot of that and just wanted to get a block out so she can deliberately practice the act of taking something like this to a finish. Because honestly, I can't count the number of times when I'm doing a contract for a client, they will provide me with very rough looking level mock-ups. Maybe they're Unreal renders, but they're very unfinished looking assets. And it's literally just my job to use that exact high definition asset to bring that up to, an artistic sort of vision. And that's what she was practicing here. And again, I think she did a very good job at that, especially when it's one of her first attempts. So, right, like basically the strategy on this one would be, right, to use like water, straight up replace that with photo elements, use 2 to 3 different sky photos, right, to kind of plop those in there, build those up, and then really dress the simplification and pushing the light and the atmosphere. Again, one of the hardest things that she contended with on this particular piece was getting this very flat, plasticky, right, looking surface on the boat and adding that sort of wetness to it to bring it into this sort of scenes. I think she did a really good job at that. And that started with just straight up replacing some of the assets with photo components right in there. You can kind of see that. You could literally see like the texture dropped in over the 3D just like that. That kind of helps quite a bit, so you don't have to model all of that. All photo bashed, undersides. The legs have a few different textural elements to that. Obviously the sky, or this version of the sky, is its own element, and then it's just really about kind of refining that. You can even see some of the sky photos see dropped in below, before basically the water's added on. So see, like, there's a lot of different things that are getting composited into a really nice 3D overpaint. Yeah, see, there's the water. It's its own layer. And then some of the, more specific elements are addressed on a very individual basis from here. But yeah, a lot of that comes down to just having an intent and a vision for a piece so you can properly integrate it. So I would recommend basically to provide a consistent sort of pass order if you're using 3D blockouts like this. Do a gesture or some sort of exaggeration pass where you're drawing over your 3D. Try out a different lighting design pass, right, with no rendered light. We looked at that today. Ask yourself where you can simplify details. Again, what is your visual hierarchy, your 1-2, sort of read in the scene, and then gradually begin to work in your painterly integration pass, right, where you're basically using your textures and you're fixing your 3D looking edges, and yeah, basically focusing on that focal point moving outward. So guys, thank you for watching. If you've made it here to the end, check out the links in the description if you need any additional help or resources, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Take care.